I would appreciate it if you could show your support by liking and subscribing to the video before you start watching. Picture this. High in the Andes Mountains, sometime during the 15th century, a young Inca warrior lies motionless on a stone altar. Blood streams from a gaping wound on his skull, inflicted by a star-shaped war club in battle. Above him, a surgeon grips an obsidian knife, its razor-sharp edge glinting in the firelight. Without anesthesia, without sterile conditions, without any of the medical knowledge we take for granted today, this ancient physician is about to perform one of the most complex surgical procedures known to humanity. He will drill a hole directly into the man's skull. And astonishingly, the patient will not only survive, he will walk away healed, forever marked by a procedure so sophisticated that it boasts an 85% survival rate, rivaling modern neurosurgery. This is the terrifying and magnificent world of Inca trepanation, a practice so advanced, so mysterious, and so disturbing in its implications that it continues to haunt archaeologists and medical historians to this day. Imagine walking through the streets of ancient Cuzco, the beating heart of the Inca Empire, encountering something that would chill your blood. Every third person you pass bears a perfectly circular scar on their forehead, the unmistakable mark of skull surgery. Children play in the shadows of temples while their parents display these haunting badges of survival. Warriors stride through markets, their heads bearing not one, but multiple surgical scars, testament to lives marked by violence and miraculous skill of their healers. What drove this ancient civilization to develop surgical techniques that wouldn't be matched by European medicine for centuries? What dark secrets lie hidden in the bone evidence scattered across museum collections worldwide? And perhaps most chilling of all, what does the sheer prevalence of these operations tell us about the violent reality of life in the world's largest pre-Columbian empire? The story you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about ancient medicine, primitive cultures, and the supposed march of human progress. It reveals a civilization that achieved medical miracles while harboring practices that would horrify modern sensibilities. It's a tale written in bone and blood, carved with obsidian blades, and preserved in the thin mountain air of the Andes for over 500 years. From the moment Spanish conquistadors first set foot in the New World, they encountered evidence of surgical practices that defied their understanding of indigenous capabilities. But it wasn't until the mid-19th century that the true scope of Inca medical achievement began to emerge from burial grounds and archaeological sites across South America. What researchers discovered would force a complete reevaluation of pre-Columbian civilization and challenge racist assumptions about the intellectual capacity of indigenous peoples. The numbers alone are staggering. In some Inca communities, over 1/3 of all individuals underwent trepanation at some point in their lives. Thousands of skulls bearing surgical holes have been recovered from sites stretching across the former empire, more than all other ancient civilizations combined. Some patients survived not just one, but 7 separate operations on their skulls, each representing a medical triumph that few modern surgeons could equal under similar conditions. But behind these remarkable statistics lies a darker truth about Inca society. A civilization where head trauma was so common that an entire medical specialty evolved to address it. The weapons of Inca warfare, star-shaped clubs, stone maces, and deadly accurate sling stones, were designed to crush skulls and shatter bones. The archaeological evidence reveals a world where violence was endemic, where even children bore the scars of systematic brutality, and where survival often depended on the steady hands of surgeons working with nothing but stone tools and plant-based medicines. Today, as we stand on the threshold of an age where brain surgery involves robotic precision and molecular-level intervention, the achievements of these ancient practitioners seem simultaneously primitive and impossibly sophisticated. They developed techniques for treating traumatic brain injury that saved countless lives, created anesthetic protocols that allowed conscious patients to endure skull surgery, and maintain infection rates lower than those achieved by American Civil War surgeons 3 centuries later. Yet questions remain that continue to disturb researchers and challenge our understanding of ancient medical ethics. Why were certain individuals subjected to multiple trepanations? What was the true purpose behind operations that seemed to serve no obvious medical function? And most unsettling of all, were some of these procedures performed not to heal but to control? The evidence is scattered across museum collections and archaeological sites from Colombia to Chile, written in the language of healed bone and surgical scars. Each skull tells a story of pain endured, risks taken, and lives forever altered by the touch of an obsidian blade. Together, they paint a picture of a civilization that pushed the boundaries of medical possibility, while operating in a world where violence and healing existed in perpetual, terrifying balance. This is the story of trepanation, the chilling art of skull drilling that reveals both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of our capacity for harm. Prepare to journey into a world where the line between healing and horror was as thin as a bone that separated the outside world from the mysteries of the human brain. In 1865, American archaeologist Ephraim George Squire stood in the ancient Inca capital of Cuzco, holding what will become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. In his hands lay a human skull, but not just any skull. This one bore the unmistakable marks of deliberate surgical intervention. A perfectly square hole, approximately half an inch wide, had been carefully cut through the frontal bone. Even more shocking, the edges showed clear signs of healing, proving beyond doubt that the patient had survived. Senora Zantino, known as the finest collector of art and antiquities in Peru, had presented this extraordinary gift to the American explorer. She had retrieved it from a vast nearby Inca burial ground, one of countless repositories of the dead that dotted the Andean landscape. But this particular skull would change everything we thought we knew about ancient medical capabilities. When Squire presented his findings to the New York Academy of Medicine, the assembled physicians refused to believe what they were seeing. The prevailing scientific racism of the era simply could not accept that primitive indigenous peoples could have mastered such advanced surgical techniques. How could ancient Andean surgeons, working with stone tools and no understanding of germ theory, achieve survival rates that wouldn't be matched by American Civil War field surgeons until centuries later? The skull showed that during the patient's life, an operation for trepanning had been performed, with a square-shaped piece of bone having been removed from the frontal bone by what appeared to have been a gouging instrument. At one portion of the opening, there seemed to be evidence of nature's attempt to form new bone to repair the injury done by the operation. But the medical establishment's resistance ran deeper than mere skepticism about surgical technique. At the time, the relationship between brain size, race, and intelligence was a hotly debated topic in scientific academies around the world. The general consensus among academics was that non-whites were less intelligent than whites because they had smaller skulls and brains. The existence of sophisticated neurosurgery among indigenous South Americans threatened this entire racial hierarchy. Squire himself marveled at what he discovered, writing that the skull had been submitted to the criticism of the best surgeons of the United States and Europe, and regarded by all as the most remarkable evidence of a knowledge of surgery among the aborigines yet discovered on this continent. For trepanning is one of the most difficult surgical processes. The cutting through the bone was not a formless saw, but evidently with a tool like that used by engravers on wood and metal. The precision was extraordinary. The opening measured exactly 58 hundredths of an inch wide and 70 hundredths long. This wasn't crude hackwork performed in desperation, but careful, methodical surgery executed with remarkable skill. The answer to how such sophisticated techniques developed would gradually emerge through decades of archaeological investigation, painting a picture of medical mastery that defied every assumption about pre-Columbian capabilities. But it would also reveal darker truths about why these operations were performed with such alarming frequency across the Inca Empire. What the assembled physicians in New York couldn't have imagined was that Squire's skull represented merely a single example of a medical tradition that had flourished across South America for over a millennium. They were looking at the product of centuries of surgical evolution, the refinement of techniques through countless operations, and the accumulation of anatomical knowledge that would have impressed Hippocrates himself. The irony was profound and tragic. European surgeons of the 19th century, despite access to manufactured instruments and formal medical training, were achieving survival rates barely half those of Inca practitioners working with obsidian blades and plant-based medicines. The conquistadors hadn't just destroyed a political empire. They had obliterated a medical system that represented one of humanity's greatest achievements in surgical technique. The numbers that would eventually emerge from systematic archaeological investigation are nothing short of staggering. In the heartland of the Inca Empire, around the sacred city of Cuzco, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of trepanation on a scale that defies comprehension. Of 411 well-preserved skulls recovered from burial sites dating between 1000 and 1532 AD, 66 showed clear evidence of surgical drilling. That's more than 1 in 6 individuals, a proportion that would be shocking even in modern urban trauma centers. But in some communities, the practice was even more widespread and systematic. At certain archaeological sites, over 1/3 of all skulls, 21 out of 59 examined specimens, bore the telltale marks of trepanation. Imagine walking through an Inca village where every third person you encountered had undergone this harrowing procedure. The social implications are staggering. Entire communities were living with the aftermath of skull surgery, their daily lives shaped by shared experiences of surgical trauma and recovery. These weren't isolated incidents or desperate last-resort surgeries performed in moments of medical crisis. This was systematic, routine medical practice conducted on what can only be described as an industrial scale. Some individuals underwent the procedure multiple times throughout their lives. One Inca skull discovered by archaeologists shows evidence of 7 separate trepanation operations, all successfully healed, each representing a medical triumph that few contemporary surgeons could match. The evidence suggests that multiple trepanations were not uncommon. Substantial minorities of patients exhibited anywhere from 2 to 7 surgical openings in their skulls, each showing signs of successful healing and long-term survival. This pattern indicates either repeated traumatic injuries requiring surgical intervention, or perhaps systematic medical management of chronic conditions that periodically required cranial access. The geographic scope of the practice is equally breathtaking and reveals the sophisticated nature of Inca medical organization. Evidence of trepanation extends across the entire former Inca Empire, a territory stretching 2,500 miles along the South American coast, encompassing parts of present-day Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. This wasn't a localized cultural phenomenon limited to specific regions or ethnic groups. It was an empire-wide medical standard that suggests centralized training, standardized techniques, and systematic knowledge transfer across vast distances. The distribution patterns also reveal important information about Inca's social hierarchy and medical access. Sites closer to major urban centers like Cuzco demonstrate higher survival rates, suggesting that the most skilled practitioners concentrated in areas serving the imperial elite. Remote provinces show more variable results, indicating that surgical expertise wasn't evenly distributed throughout the empire, and that access to high-quality medical care reflected social and geographic privilege. Archaeological evidence from different time periods shows clear evolution in both technique and outcomes. Pre-Inca sites, dating from around 400 BC to 1000 AD, show survival rates between 40 to 53%. During the height of the Inca Empire, from 1400 to 1532 AD, survival rates climbed to an astonishing 80 to 91%. This improvement wasn't accidental. It represents systematic refinement of surgical technique through centuries of observation, experimentation, and knowledge accumulation. The demographic patterns revealed in the skeletal evidence tell disturbing stories about Inca society. The vast majority of trepanation patients were adult males, particularly young warriors in their prime fighting years. This suggests that military service carried extraordinary risks, with head injuries occurring at rates that necessitated systematic surgical response. The Inca Empire's rapid expansion across South America came at a terrible human cost, paid primarily by the soldiers who fought to extend imperial boundaries. But the practice wasn't limited to warriors. Women and children also underwent trepanation, though less frequently. Female patients may have suffered domestic violence, participated in conflicts as non-combatants, or experienced accidents that resulted in traumatic head injuries. Child patients present perhaps the most troubling cases. Evidence of society where even the youngest members weren't protected from violence severe enough to require skull surgery. The survival of multiple trepanation patients tells another deeply disturbing story about the nature of violence in Inca society. These individuals had endured repeated head trauma throughout their lives, suggesting either exceptionally violent careers as professional soldiers, participation in ritualized combat, or systematic abuse that required periodic surgical intervention. The skeletal evidence provides no clear answers about the specific circumstances, leaving us to wonder about lives marked by recurring violence and the remarkable resilience of those who survived it. Peru has yielded more trepan skulls than everywhere else in the world combined. This concentration isn't merely a result of favorable preservation conditions in the Andean environment, though the high altitude, low humidity climate certainly contributed to the excellent condition of skeletal remains. Rather, it reflects the extraordinary prevalence of the practice within Inca civilization and the sophisticated medical infrastructure that supported it. The sheer volume of evidence forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of pre-Columbian society. Was the Inca Empire exceptionally violent, generating levels of head trauma that required systematic surgical response? Or do the skeletal remains represent only the most severe cases, with countless additional injuries treated through less invasive methods that left no archaeological trace? The journey towards surgical mastery was written in bone and paid for in blood, a grim chronicle of human experimentation that spans over a millennium of Andean medical development. Early trepanation attempts, dating from around 400 BC to 200 BC, tell a sobering story of trial and error, where medical innovation was measured in human lives and surgical advancement came at a terrible cost. Archaeological evidence from these earliest periods reveals the harsh reality of primitive neurosurgery. Approximately half of the earliest patients died, their skulls showing no signs of healing around the surgical sites. Silent testimony to operations that ended in failure. The holes were large, crude, and often penetrated too deeply into the skull, likely damaging the delicate dura mater, the protective membrane surrounding the brain. These early surgeons were literally learning their craft on living patients, with fatal consequences for many who trusted their lives to experimental techniques. But over the centuries, something remarkable happened. Inca surgeons methodically refined their techniques through systematic observation, experimentation, and the accumulation of anatomical knowledge that would have impressed the greatest physicians of ancient Greece and Rome. By 1000 AD, survival rates had climbed to 53%, a significant improvement, but still representing a coin flip chance of survival for anyone undergoing the procedure. The real breakthrough came during the height of the Inca Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries. By this time, an astounding 80 to 91% of patients survived the procedure, a success rate that wouldn't be achieved by European surgeons until the advent of antiseptics and anesthesia in the 19th century. This represents one of the most dramatic improvements in surgical outcomes in human history, achieved without any understanding of germ theory or access to manufactured medical instruments. How did they accomplish this medical miracle? The answer lies in painstaking attention to anatomical detail that would make modern neurosurgeons envious. Through centuries of direct observation during surgical procedures, Inca physicians gradually mapped the dangerous areas of the skull where major blood vessels ran close to the surface. They learned to avoid cutting cranial muscles in locations where damage would cause excessive bleeding or functional impairment. Most importantly, they mastered the delicate art of approaching the dura mater, the tough membrane that protects the brain itself. Early surgeons frequently punctured this critical barrier, leading to brain damage, infection, and death. By the Inca period, practitioners had developed such precise control over their drilling depth that they could consistently stop just short of this protective layer, creating surgical openings that provided access without causing catastrophic damage. The evolution of surgical technique itself represents a masterpiece of medical innovation. Archaeological evidence reveals 4 distinct approaches that developed over time, each representing increasingly sophisticated understanding of cranial anatomy and surgical precision. The earliest technique involved cutting out square sections of bone, creating large rectangular openings that provided maximum access to the underlying tissues. This crude method often removed more tissue than necessary and carried extremely high risks of infection, excessive bleeding, and brain damage. The survival rates from this period reflect the inherent dangers of such aggressive surgical approaches. Drilling represented the next evolutionary step, utilizing bronze, stone, or obsidian implements to bore circular holes through the skull. While more controlled than cutting, this method still carried significant risks of sudden penetration to the skull's inner layer, potentially causing catastrophic damage to the brain tissue beneath. The technique that ultimately became the Inca's standard was scraping, a painstakingly slow process that gradually wore away bone tissue layer by microscopic layer. This method provided maximum control over the depth of penetration, allowing surgeons to approach the critical dura mater with extraordinary precision. The resulting holes were perfectly circular, with smooth, beveled edges that promoted natural healing processes and minimized the risk of infection. The most advanced technique involved making precise circular incisions to remove perfectly round plugs of bone. This method required extraordinary skill and anatomical knowledge, as the surgeon had to cut through the full thickness of the skull while maintaining perfect circular symmetry. Evidence suggests that some practitioners even attempted to replace these bone plugs after completing the procedures, an early form of cranial reconstruction that wouldn't be mastered in Europe until the Renaissance. The instruments themselves evolved from crude drilling implements to sophisticated surgical tools that rivaled anything available to European physicians of the same period. Archaeological evidence suggests they used bronze, copper, gold, and obsidian implements, with the latter capable of achieving edges sharper than modern steel scalpels. The T-shaped Toomey knife became their signature instrument, its crescent blade allowing for precise, controlled cuts with minimal tissue damage. The actual surgical procedures followed rigorous protocols that demonstrate remarkable understanding of surgical principles. Patients' heads were shaved using obsidian razors that could achieve cuts sharper than modern steel blades. The scalp was meticulously cleaned and treated with numbing preparations, likely including coca leaves and other plant-based analgesics. The surgical site was carefully positioned to avoid major blood vessels, muscle attachments, and other vulnerable anatomical structures. Perhaps most remarkably, Inca surgeons developed systematic approaches to managing surgical complications. Evidence of successful multiple trepanations suggests they had protocols for addressing infections, managing excessive bleeding, and treating cases where initial procedures were insufficient. Some skulls show evidence of careful bone grafting, where surgeons attempted to repair large cranial defects using transplanted bone tissue. To understand why trepanation became so prevalent among the Incas, we must first confront the brutal reality of how they fought and died. Inca warfare was personal, visceral, and devastatingly effective, conducted with weapons specifically designed to crush skulls and shatter bones rather than pierce or slice. The archaeological record reads like a catalog of cranial trauma, each fractured skull telling a story of violence that demanded systematic surgical response. The star-shaped war clubs called pores represent perhaps the most terrifying weapons in the Inca arsenal. These brutal implements, carved from hardwood and fitted with stone or metal heads shaped like geometric stars, could split a human skull with a single well-placed blow. The star-shaped design wasn't merely decorative. The multiple pointed projections concentrated tremendous force into small areas, virtually guaranteeing penetrating cranial fractures that drove bone fragments deep into brain tissue. Stone-headed maces delivered equally devastating blunt force trauma, creating the type of depressed skull fractures that appear repeatedly in archaeological collections. These weapons were designed for close-quarter combat, where warriors could deliver crushing blows with maximum force. The resulting injuries often created complex fracture patterns that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent death from intracranial pressure and brain swelling. Perhaps most deadly of all were the sling stones, seemingly simple weapons that in skilled hands became instruments of terrifying precision. Inca slingers could achieve accuracy that rivaled modern firearms, hurling stones with sufficient velocity to shatter skulls at considerable distances. The archaeological evidence shows that these projectiles frequently caused focal cranial fractures that matched exactly the size and shape of typical sling stones, providing clear evidence of their effectiveness as weapons of war. The archaeological evidence tells a violent story written in fractured bone and surgical scars. The vast majority of trepan remains show clear signs of traumatic head injuries, particularly concentrated on the left frontal region of the skull, exactly where a right-handed opponent would deliver maximum damage during face-to-face combat. These weren't accidental injuries from falls, construction accidents, or domestic mishaps. They were the deliberate wounds of organized warfare. When a warrior's skull was fractured in battle, several life-threatening complications could develop within hours. Bone fragments driven below the skull surface created dangerous intracranial pressure as the brain swelled in response to trauma. Blood clots formed between the skull and brain tissue, pressing against delicate neural structures and potentially causing permanent damage or death. Brain swelling caused by the initial trauma could prove fatal within a matter of hours if left untreated. Inca surgeons recognized that rapid intervention could mean the difference between life and death for traumatically injured warriors. They developed what may have been the world's first systematic protocols for treating battlefield head trauma, creating standardized approaches to emergency cranial surgery that saved countless lives. The frequency of successful multiple trepanations suggests they even performed follow-up procedures to address complications, secondary bleeding, or additional injuries sustained in subsequent battles. The patterns of injury and surgical response revealed disturbing truths about the nature of Inca society and the human cost of imperial expansion. The concentration of trepanation cases among young adult males reflects a civilization where military service was both obligatory and extraordinarily dangerous. The rapid expansion of the Inca Empire across South America required constant warfare, with each conquest paid for in the blood of warriors whose skulls bear testament to the violence they endured. The weapons used in Inca warfare were particularly suited to causing the type of cranial trauma that required surgical intervention. Unlike the piercing wounds caused by arrows, spears, or swords in other cultures, the crushing injuries inflicted by clubs, maces, and sling stones created complex fracture patterns that couldn't heal naturally. This weapons technology essentially created a medical crisis that demanded surgical solutions, leading to the extraordinary development of neurosurgical techniques. As we stand at the threshold of an age where brain surgery involves robotic precision and molecular-level intervention, the achievement of Inca trepanation practitioners seems simultaneously primitive and impossibly sophisticated. Using nothing but stone tools, plant-based medicines, and accumulated wisdom passed down through generations, they achieve surgical outcomes that modern medicine struggles to match. The skeletal evidence tells a story of human ingenuity triumphing over seemingly impossible obstacles. In the thin air of the high Andes, without understanding of germ theory or access to manufactured instruments, indigenous surgeons developed techniques that saved countless lives and alleviated immeasurable suffering. Their 85% survival rate stands as a testament to surgical skill that wouldn't be equaled by European medicine until the advent of antiseptics in the 19th century. But the evidence also reveals darker truths about violence, hierarchy, and the human cost of empire. The prevalence of head trauma requiring surgical intervention speaks to a society where conflict was endemic and safety was a luxury few could afford. The differential outcomes between elite and common patients reflect social inequalities that determined who lived and who died. Perhaps most troubling is the systematic destruction of this knowledge by European colonizers, representing not just cultural genocide, but the obliteration of medical wisdom that could have benefited all humanity. The recovery of Inca surgical techniques required centuries of archaeological detective work, piecing together fragments of lost understanding from silent bone testimony. The story of Inca trepanation ultimately transcends medical history to become a meditation on human capability, cultural transmission, and the fragility of knowledge. It reminds us that sophistication and barbarism can coexist within the same society, that medical advancement doesn't always follow linear progression, and that the loss of cultural knowledge impoverishes us all. The echoes of ancient hammering still resonate in modern operating rooms, where neurosurgeons continue the same fundamental mission: to drill through bone, navigate the brain's delicate geography, and restore the miracle of human consciousness. The tools have evolved, but the courage required remains unchanged. The willingness to take calculated risks in pursuit of healing, to literally open minds in hope of saving lives.